Don't look at the door. Alex had always been skeptical of the supernatural. Ghosts, demons, and urban legends were nothing more than stories to him, until the night he first heard the tapping. It was a little after 3 a.m. when he woke up to the sound. Tap. 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 His bedroom door was shut, as it always was before he went to bed. He stared at it from the safety of his blanket, waiting. Silence. Maybe he had imagined it. Shaking his head, he rolled over and closed his eyes again. Tap. 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 A chill crawled up his spine. He sat up, his heart starting to race. The apartment was silent except for the faint humming of the refrigerator in the kitchen. His roommate, Matt, was out of town, and no one else had a key. It had to be the wind, he reasoned. Or maybe the neighbors. But something about the sound unsettled him. It wasn't random. It was too rhythmic. Too deliberate. Alex cleared his throat. Hello. Silence. Swallowing the growing unease, he lay back down, pulling the blanket up to his chin. The moment his eyes shut. Tap. 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 A surge of cold fear wrapped around his chest. This time, he didn't move. He didn't answer. Instead, he closed his eyes tightly and waited for morning. The next day, Alex tried to forget about it. It was easy to brush off, until night came. Dread settled deep in his stomach as he climbed into bed, his eyes flicking toward the door more often than he cared to admit. The apartment was silent. Too silent. He forced himself to relax. It was just paranoia. His mind playing tricks on him. Then. Tap. 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 Alex's breath hitched. It was the exact same pattern as the night before. Then came the scratching. At first, it was soft, like a fingernail barely dragging across wood. But then it grew stronger, deeper, more insistent, as if someone was running razor-sharp nails down the door. His stomach twisted into knots. Then came the worst part. The doorknob turned. It didn't rattle. It didn't shake violently. It turned slowly, as if whatever was on the other side knew he was watching. Alex shot up in bed, his pulse pounding in his ears. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. He wanted to check. He wanted to get up and throw open the door to prove to himself that nothing was there. But something inside him whispered. Don't. And somehow, he knew. If he opened that door, he wouldn't be alone. Alex didn't sleep. By morning, he was exhausted, but he still refused to acknowledge what was happening. Sleep deprivation. Stress. That's all it was. That night, he shoved a chair under the doorknob. It made him feel safer, if only slightly. By 3 a.m., he was still awake. Then the whispers began. At first, they were faint. Just the sound of air moving through the room. But then he heard it. Don't look at the door. A chill ran through his entire body. He squeezed his eyes shut, pulling the blanket over his head. His breathing was shallow, his hands trembling. If you look, it will see you. The voice was right beside him. Alex could feel something standing next to his bed. His body screamed at him to move, to run, but he was paralyzed with fear. And then, in the deafening silence, the voice spoke one last time. It knows you can hear it. The moment the first sliver of sunlight crept through the blinds, the presence was gone. But the damage was already done. It knew. Alex's mind was unraveling. He avoided his bedroom during the day, but no matter where he went, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He considered staying at a friend's place, but some part of him feared that whatever it was would follow him. That night, he made a decision. He would look. He needed to know what was happening. By 3:12 a.m., the tapping started. Tap. 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 Then the scratching. Scratch. Then the voice. Look at the door. His heart pounded. Sweat dripped down his forehead. He looked. The door was wide open. And something stood in the doorway. It was tall. Its limbs were too long. Its mouth was stretched into an inhuman, lipless grin. But its eyes, black, hollow voids, were the worst part. They locked onto his. Then, it moved. Alex didn't remember screaming. He didn't remember running. The next thing he knew, he was outside, standing barefoot in the freezing night air, staring up at his apartment window. His bedroom light was still on. And in the window, it stood there. Staring down at him. Grinning. He never went back inside. It didn't matter. Because now, it followed him. No matter where he went, at exactly 3:12 a.m., he would hear it. Tap. 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 And the whisper would always follow. Look at the door. No matter how hard he tried, he could never sleep again. Because the moment he closed his eyes, it would be waiting. Sleep paralysis demon. Jason had always been a deep sleeper. But lately, his nights had turned into something else, something horrifying. It started subtly. He'd wake up at odd hours, drenched in sweat, with a sinking feeling that something was watching him. At first, there was nothing but the suffocating silence of his dark bedroom. The faint hum of his ceiling fan. The distant sound of cars outside. Nothing unusual. Then came the paralysis. The first time it happened, Jason woke up in the middle of the night, eyes wide open, heart hammering in his chest. He could feel his body, but he couldn't move. His arms, legs, even his fingers refused to obey. A heavy weight pressed down on his chest, as if something unseen was holding him down. Panic set in. He wanted to scream, to cry out, but his mouth wouldn't move. His breathing grew ragged as his eyes darted around the room, searching for anything, any sign that this was just a dream. That's when he saw it. A shape in the farthest corner of the room. Something crouched low, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. It was humanoid, but grotesquely thin, its limbs too long, its face obscured in shadow. It was watching him. Jason's mind screamed for him to wake up, to move, to do something. But all he could do was stare in horror as the figure crawled closer. The moment it reached the foot of his bed, Jason's body suddenly jolted, he could move again. He gasped, sitting upright, chest heaving. He frantically scanned the room. The figure was gone. For hours, he sat awake, trying to convince himself it was just a hallucination. A trick of his mind. But deep down, he knew. It was real. And it was coming back. The episodes didn't stop. Every night, Jason found himself paralyzed, trapped in his own body, helpless as the shadowy figure returned. And now, it whispered. At first, the voice was barely a breath against his ear, a soundless vibration that scraped against his mind. Let me in. Jason couldn't move. Couldn't speak. His throat was locked, his body frozen in terror. The creature lingered at the foot of his bed, its head tilting unnaturally, as if studying him. The second night, it whispered again. I see you. By the third night, Jason stopped sleeping altogether. His body ached from exhaustion, his eyes burned, but he refused to close them. He couldn't risk facing it again. Then, one night, as he sat in bed, forcing himself to stay awake, something changed. He wasn't paralyzed. But the whisper still came. Don't fight it. Jason's breath hitched. The voice wasn't inside his head anymore. It was coming from the foot of his bed. Slowly, his eyes trailed downward. And this time, the creature wasn't just in his dreams. It was real. Jason's reality began to crumble. At first, he convinced himself it was a hallucination. But as the nights passed, the entity grew bolder. It was no longer confined to his sleep. It was here. In his waking world. Sometimes, Jason saw it in the shadows of his bedroom. Other times, he caught glimpses of it in the reflection of his bathroom mirror, its hollow eyes staring back at him. It was never gone. Then came the touch. Jason woke up one night, heart pounding, a chilling presence beside him. A slow, cold pressure traced along his arm. His breath hitched. It was touching him. He couldn't scream. He couldn't move. He could only feel its skeletal fingers pressing against his skin, its breath against his cheek. Then, for the first time, it laughed. Jason was desperate. He researched sleep paralysis, saged his room, even visited a priest. Nothing worked. The entity was growing stronger. Now, Jason didn't even need to be asleep to see it. He saw it in daylight, in darkened windows, in his own reflection. And then, it hurt him. One morning, he woke up to deep, jagged scratches along his arms and chest. His bed sheets were shredded. His mirror had a single, claw-like streak running across it. That night, he tried to stay awake. But exhaustion won. At 3 a.m., Jason's eyes fluttered open. He couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The entity was on top of him. Its bony fingers wrapped around his throat. Its grin stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. It exuded a rancid stench, like rotting flesh. Jason's vision blurred. His lungs screamed for air. Then, the whisper came. Almost mine. Darkness took him. Jason couldn't take it anymore. He packed a bag and fled, checking into a hotel miles away. He locked the doors, left every light on, and finally allowed himself to relax. It was over. Or so he thought. At 3 a.m., he stirred awake. A chill ran through the room. Then, a whisper. Found you. Jason froze. The room's temperature plummeted. The lights flickered. His breath hitched as he realized, he couldn't move. In the mirror across from the bed, he saw it. Standing right behind him. It was no longer a shadow, no longer a whisper. It was here. And this time. It wasn't leaving. The last thing Jason felt was its hands closing around his throat. The last thing he heard was laughter. The shadow under the bed. Daniel had never been afraid of the dark. At 25, he considered himself rational, a man of logic rather than superstition. But ever since moving into his new apartment, strange things had started happening. It began subtly. Objects shifted slightly from where he left them. His phone charger, always plugged in beside his bed, would be coiled up on the floor. The closet door, which he always shut before sleeping, would be slightly ajar in the morning. One night, as he reached under his bed for a fallen book, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A shape, darker than the surrounding shadows, seemed to retreat as his fingers brushed the floor. He yanked his hand back, heart pounding. Was it just a trick of the light? Shaking off his unease, Daniel climbed into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The feeling of something watching him from the darkness lingered. Over the next few nights, Daniel tried to ignore the unsettling feeling, but it only got worse. He began hearing faint noises, soft, slow scratching against the wooden floor beneath his bed. At first, he convinced himself it was mice or some other pest. But as he leaned over the edge one night, shining his phone's flashlight beneath the bed, he saw only emptiness. The sound stopped instantly. He lay back down, phone still in hand. Seconds later, the scratching resumed. This time, it was closer. Something was down there. His breath caught in his throat as the noise shifted. A slow, deliberate dragging sound, like nails scraping along the wood, moved toward the edge of the bed where he lay. He shot up and flicked on the lamp. Silence. Nothing but the faint hum of his air conditioner. He didn't sleep at all that night. Daniel considered sleeping on the couch, but part of him refused to give in to what he assumed were irrational fears. He even tried moving the bed, thinking maybe the sounds were coming from something underneath the floorboards. But that didn't explain what happened next. Around 2 a.m., as he lay staring at the ceiling, he heard a whisper. At first, he thought it was coming from outside. But as he strained to listen, he realized with stomach-churning certainty, it was coming from under the bed. A slow, raspy voice, barely more than a breath, murmured his name. Daniel. He bolted upright, his pulse hammering. The voice was so quiet, yet so clear. He forced himself to look over the edge of the bed, his whole body tense. He turned on his phone's flashlight and peered beneath. There was nothing there. But the whispering didn't stop. It was coming from somewhere much darker. Somewhere just beyond the reach of the light. Daniel refused to sleep. He sat upright in bed, every light in his apartment turned on. He didn't care how ridiculous it seemed. But exhaustion eventually took its toll. At some point in the early hours of the morning, he drifted off. He woke up to a freezing chill against his arm. His eyes fluttered open, and his breath caught in his throat. A hand, long, thin, and impossibly dark, was gripping his wrist. It was reaching up from under the bed. Daniel let out a strangled cry and yanked his arm away, scrambling to the opposite side of the mattress. He didn't dare move, heart hammering as he watched the space below his bed. Slowly, the hand withdrew into the shadows. And then, something began to emerge. Two hollow, black eyes stared at him from the darkness beneath the bed, its face stretching into an unnatural grin. Daniel didn't think. He leapt from the bed and sprinted out of the room, slamming the door behind him. He spent the rest of the night locked in his bathroom, refusing to come out until daylight. Morning brought no comfort. Daniel barely ate. He barely moved. He debated calling someone, his brother, his friend, anyone who would believe him. But he knew the truth. No one would. By nightfall, he made a decision. He wouldn't sleep in that room anymore. He'd stay on the couch. Maybe even move out. But as he walked past his bedroom to grab some clothes, he made the mistake of glancing inside. The bed. It had moved. It wasn't against the wall anymore. It had been dragged into the center of the room. And underneath, the shadows were deeper than they should be. As Daniel stared, paralyzed in the doorway, something shifted in the darkness beneath the bed. And then, the whisper came again. Daniel, come back to bed. The door slammed shut on its own. And the lights went out.